For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This last Friday, I had the honor of being able to speak by telephone with 5 brave human rights activists, pro-democracy leaders inside the totalitarian nightmare that is Castro's Cuba. One of the great heroes of the pro-democracy movement inside the Cuban totalitarian nightmare is Jorge Luis Garcia Perez, Antunez. A black man now in his 40s, Antunez was first imprisoned while he was in high school because of his support for democracy and his opposition to totalitarianism. For 17 years, Antunez was regularly beaten as a political prisoner in Castro's Gulag. He never gave in. He was released from the Gulag last year, but since he never surrenders, he doesn't stop denouncing the thugs and pirates who have destroyed, impoverished, and oppressed the Cuban people for 50 years. Antunez has been routinely detained dozens of times, thrown into a dungeon, and subsequently released since his release from the Gulag. Some days ago, Antunez began a hunger strike in his city of Placetas in Sancti Spiritus Province, Cuba, calling for the end of the death threats being leveled against Cuban political prisoner Mario Alberto Perez Aguilera, an end to the physical and psychological torture of all Cuban political prisoners, and the cruel and cynical prohibition by the dictatorship against Antunez's sister, Caridad Garcia Perez, being able to rebuild her own house. They don't allow her to rebuild her own house, which was destroyed by one of the devastating recent hurricanes that passed by Cuba. Accompanying the hero Antunez, when I was able to contact him by telephone on Friday, was his wife, the pro-democracy leader Iris Perez Aguilera, whose brother, Mario Alberto Perez Aguilera, is the political prisoner receiving death threats, I'm sure one of many, but the one specified by Antunez, receiving death threats by his jailers. And I also spoke to pro-democracy leaders Carlos Micael Morales Rodriguez, Alejandro Tur Valladares, and Ernesto Mederos. It was my honor to speak with all of them. Antunez's house was surrounded by state security thugs while we spoke, and he and his colleagues knew very well that our telephone conversation was being monitored by the thug regime. The courage of these pro-democracy leaders is simply awe-inspiring. They all explained their human rights work and reiterated their commitment to freedom. I told Antunez that I would be speaking in the U.S. Congress this week about him, about his hunger strike, about his heroic struggle for freedom and the heroic struggle of the other pro-democracy leaders I spoke to, and about all of Cuba's political prisoners. Fidel Castro and his brother, who now has some titles because of the dictator's intestinal illness, constitute the historical revenge of the brutal, racist European colonialism that the Cubans fought to overthrow for almost a century. But they ultimately prevailed. Antunez, Bisset, and the other pro-democracy leaders who continue to fight the Castro's diarchy represent today's version of Maceo, Banderas, Moncada, and all the freedom fighters who ultimately obtained freedom for Cuba. Now, one of the disgusting realities of today is that the fight of the unarmed Cuban people doesn't exist for the international media and the press, with very dignified exceptions. Why are the Cubans non-persons for so much of the media? Their racial discrimination is as shameful as it is condemnable. But Antunez, Bisset, and the other Cuban freedom fighters will prevail. They are the future leaders of Free Cuba. Antunez's last words to me on Friday said it all. Tell your colleagues, the representatives of the American people, Antunez ni se rinde ni se va. Antunez neither surrenders nor leaves. Some are advocating that the new administration agree to the expulsion from Cuba to the U.S. of Bisset, Antunez, and the other future leaders of Cuba in exchange for some Castro spies currently in U.S. federal prisons serving time for conspiring to murder U.S. citizens. That would be a condemnable act that would violate international law as well as the elemental human rights of Cuba's future leaders. From the floor of the U.S. Congress, I reiterate my admiration for those leaders who confront the totalitarian monster from within Cuba today and who will lead Free Cuba tomorrow.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.